Welcome to the New Thinking for a New World podcast, where we explore the most pressing issues that are challenging and changing our societies. We are looking for new thinking and new solutions, wherever we can find them. Listen as host Alan Stoga, the Tilburg Foundation's chairman, challenges his guests for analysis, ideas and actions. Together we can help make our world at least a little bit better.
One of the fundamental divides in Europe today is over social, cultural, and religious values. The divide pits the increasingly illiberal East against the liberal West, with leaders like Hungary's President Orban and Poland's President Duda trying to change not only their own country's laws and institutions, but to shift the center of gravity of Europe's values to the right. How likely are they to succeed? Will they change their national realities? Or will they make changes on the larger European or even global stages? My guests today are deeply involved in these issues, and both are engaged in this cultural conflict. Both are lawyers. Zuzanna Rudzińska-Bluszcz serves at Poland's Office of the Commissioner for Human Rights, and András Léderer is the Senior Advocacy Officer of the Hungarian Helsinki Committee. Welcome.
Welcome.
Hello.
Let me start with the meta question. Do Hungary and Poland really belong to the Europe of the early 21st century? Zuzanna?
Well, of course. And my answer would never be other than, of course, we do belong into Europe, into the European values. We are in the European Union for now over 15 years, and we are part of the European family, and we will, I hope. However, as you mentioned in your introduction, there are certain, obstacles to this, and some of our politicians try to drift apart from European Union.
András, Zuzanna was optimistic, but I did notice you use the word "I hope," or the words "I hope." I'm sure you hope as well, but what do you think? Is Hungary really part of the Europe that's evolving in 2021?
I think that one of the questions is, and I don't want to circumvent the answer, but what do you understand by Europe? And if you look at the past 10 years of certain policy developments in Europe itself, you see that, for example, Orban had a quite significant impact on some of them. So I'm not sure whether you can actually make 10 years after the second government of Prime Minister Viktor Orban took office and by now consolidated its illiberal regime in Hungary, I'm not sure you can actually make that distinction so easily. That's one of the answers. The other answer is that there is, I think, a huge difference between the political elite in Hungary, and I think it's quite similar in Poland in many ways. So what you see about Hungary when you look at the political elite and what you would see of Hungary if you would talk to the 10 million inhabitants in the country. It's not the same. So there have been, for the past many years, regular, suggestions why Hungary is not leaving the EU, why the Prime Minister is not changing course and leaving the EU, especially after Brexit. You have these debates recurring every now and then, and there is a very clear answer to that. Over 80% of the population is in clear favor of being part of the European Union. And it's not just about financial matters, but it's also about ideas and a sense of belonging. I think it's the same in Poland. So for us, Eastern European countries, the time I remember very well, very vividly, when we joined the EU in 2004, it was such an honest uproar of celebration, the sense of we finally arrived, that I think it would take a lot of energy to turn this around and to create a population that is in favor of leaving this community, which is again not just a community of business interests and financial interests, but of values as well.
To the point you just made, there's very little evidence that either the Hungarian leadership or the Polish leadership want to leave Europe, leave the European institutions. There's a lot of evidence they want to change them. And there's a nonstop war between Brussels and Budapest and Brussels and Warsaw. Practically every week, you see yet another front open in that struggle. Two very related but different questions. One, you imply that Europe is changing perhaps towards Orban. And two, the question about this constant struggle. Nobody wants to kick either country out and neither country wants to leave. So there's always a compromise, good European fashion. But in the process, it looks to be a mess.
There are many answers to those issues. I think that Europe right now has to answer some crucial questions as to what it is and where it wants to head. As András said, also in Poland, there is a very strong support for the idea of European Union, understood generally as a democracy, a rule of law, and human rights union community. However, when you look closer and when you look at the values you mentioned, Alan, there is no common consent. And the last month in Poland, which were torn by the protest regarding reproductive rights, are the best example. So the question is how deep EU wants to involve into the national acts, into the national laws that regulate the relations between the society. And I wouldn't answer that EU is less or more liberal. I would say it's hesitant. And the very good example is the reform of justice system in Poland, which is clearly going into the direction of competitive authoritarianism, so to call it, or illiberal democracy. So this is what the Law and Justice, taking an example of Orban, wants to do, so to subordinate the justice system into the hands of politicians. And I think that EU has shown to be a toothless tiger in this battle. And the question is not only regarding the values, but also how deep EU wants to get involved and how much control it wants to keep regarding the national legal system.
András?
Yeah, it's... I think what Zuzanna said, I agree with most of it, but there is one issue where I think Poland and Hungary is a bit different. I have the strong feeling that the Polish regime is they actually believe in the values they are propagating. They actually believe that what they are trying to push through, for example, regarding reproductive rights, is the right thing to do. I'm not saying that that's better or worse, but compared to that, the Hungarian illiberal regime, I think, is extremely cynical. So in that sense, anything can be put on the agenda, and at any given day, just the exact opposite could become the top of the agenda. And from the EU's perspective, many of these issues rather seem like a policy debate or technical questions of implementation of various EU law instruments. And for a very long time, the EU, I think, failed to understand what is actually happening here. It's beginning to wake up, and I hope it's not too late. But there is certainly a shift. Just to give you one example, last December, after a tremendous amount of debates and veto threats and actual vetoes by both the Polish and the Hungarian government, Finally, the EU introduced a new mechanism to ensure that EU development funds, which play a crucial role in both countries' budgets, they can only be spent in line with basic principles of the rule of law. We'll see how this mechanism will work in practice, but I think that shows that the EU is slowly waking up. However, when I referred to in the beginning to the problem of the definition of what the 21st century Europe means, and how certain policies were making their way into other European countries, I didn't highlight the other side of the coin, which is once these are not about minor policy issues, once these discussions are no longer at the technical level, but at more fundamental value level debates, then the vast majority of the population in Western European member states, they are against the illiberalization of Europe. And that gives me a lot of hope in the sense that there is stronger resilience among other member states and also among EU institutions to these kind of political regimes. Some policy issues might still get through, but the way decisions are made, the way we reach to these results will hopefully never be similar to what's happening in Hungary and in Poland. And I think that's a very important distinction to make.
That's also the way into the domestic political question in both countries. Because in both Poland and Hungary, there is clearly a deep divide between right and left, conservative, illiberal, and liberal, maybe religious and secular. You see it over all sorts of issues, reproductive rights, migration, etc. But in both countries, the right keeps on winning elections. So you've both implied that there is a gap between the political elite and the people, yet however the elections are working, people keep on voting for these regimes. Narrow margins, I'm not arguing overwhelming margins, but narrow margins are still margins. Why do the more liberal kinds of politicians, kinds of political ideas seem to lose elections in both of your countries?
There are plenty of reasons for sure, and I think some of them resemble the reasons that were analyzed after the Trump election a few years ago. So first of all, I would say that transformation in Poland, which happened in 1989, as we all know, and was a perfect example of a democratic and peaceful transformation in the former Soviet bloc. Well, the transformation was not of the same value for everyone. And there was huge disparity of welfare between the bigger cities and smaller cities and villages. Some social groups were left behind. And the politicians, I say we as Poland, but some politicians also forgot of protecting some of the basic rights like social housing or protection against abusive practices at the labor market. I know it sounds maybe weird when we talk about abusive practices on the labor market, considering the US legal system when it comes to labor law. But in Europe, we are very much used to strong protection when it comes to employment. So transformation was not of the same value. And 2015, which was the year when Law and Justice came into power, was also a very special year. We have to remember that this was the first hit of the migrant crisis in the European Union. So it was very easy for the right-wing parties to reach for power, gather people around the ideology based on traditional values, on national pride, and just win the election, addressing the fears that were among the society. But of course, Alan, I see your face, and I can imagine that your question will be okay. But in the meantime, there was another election, so it wasn't the migrant crisis here, and people saw what happened during the 4 years of the Law and Justice ruling in Poland, so that many reforms were against the constitution and were just illegal. And I'm not afraid to say this as a lawyer. So my answer would be that also for many years now, I would say from the beginning of transformation, the legal education, the democratic education, the civic education was just neglected, and nobody paid attention to what to building a strong civic society in Poland and to building the sense of belonging. And it's really needed in the society that was torn, that was well, maybe not torn, but that was soaked into Homo Sovieticus mentality for over 50 years. So I think leaving behind some issues, leaving behind some groups on the one hand, and then lack of introducing the decent education into what those abstract values like rule of law or tripartite division of powers are, led to the illiberal and populistic groups to take over power.
András, the same question, but with a slightly different twist. Orban has been around for a while already, as has his Fidesz. Are they on the rise or are they on the fall? What do you think their trajectory is? Because it isn't just how did we get to this moment, but where we're going. And Zuzanna made the point that in Poland, they were reelected. In Hungary, they've been reelected. Still close margins. But how do you see the future from a democratic point of view?
The situation is also different in Hungary compared to Poland, because not just because of the length of time the regime has been in power, but because of the extremely extensive changes it introduced to the political landscape. And I'm not simply talking about new election system, a new fundamental law or constitution, if you like, and so on, but there has been I would say, a complete reshaping of how public works and how the society works. What I mean, for example, is the total takeover of state-owned media, which I know is a very minuscule, probably completely irrelevant issue in the US. But in most Eastern European states, and especially in Hungary, public media, which is practically state-owned media, has still the largest reach in the country. Turning that into a 1984 Orwell-style propaganda machine is very effective, because if people can only watch that and there is nothing else to watch and they don't speak other languages, so they can't, fact check what they are being told, then that reality over 10 years becomes your reality. So I think that the situation, one of the reasons why it's different in Hungary is this. The other reason, I completely agree with what Zuzanna said about the legacy we have from the 20th century. There is one further thing which didn't occur in Poland, but was the foundation of the Kádár regime of the post-1955, 1956 revolution in Hungary, is a compromise made between the political elite and the population. And the compromise was very basic. As long as the political elite provides for a growing standard of living, or at least can upkeep that standard of living, the population is not going to complain, and people are not going to try to enter politics and enter public life. And that kind of compromise, I think, is one of the most serious threats to any kind of democracy, because it tells you that you are not a citizen who should get involved actively in public matters, but you should keep your mouth shut as long as you meet ends at the end of the month. And when you have generations of people growing up like this in a country, that really stays with you. So if you see how the EU development funds help upkeeping a standard of living in Hungary, you see how this kind of compromise, how people say, well, I would rather not criticize this and that because I have a job, and I can see what's happening to other people who stand up and criticize certain policies or maybe the entire government. I don't want to risk losing my status. I don't want to risk what I have right now. It's fine. So whether I'm hopeful or not, I see the new numbers. We have elections next year. The opposition is trying a different methodology, how to run compared to the past years. This is again a technical issue. I see that the opposition is gaining popularity, but at the same time, the structural problems remain the same. And one last remark, especially after what happened in the US in January, you will really understand that if someone, especially if it's not a person, but a large group of people feel that they have a lot to lose, then the question of willingness of holding free and fair elections, which already was not completely the case 3 years ago, according to OSCE monitoring mission, and whether they are going to agree to a peaceful transition, especially taking into account all the constitutional changes they introduced, I have my doubts. So I think the next year elections is not simply a question of whether the opposition gets more votes or Fidesz gets more votes. It's going to be a much more complicated and complex story.
Susan?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to what András said, that it's about dignity and respecting this dignity by politicians, and being an observer and active human rights lawyer in the Polish public life, I must say that we have problems with respecting this individual's dignity, and I think this is the starting point of populistic groups taking power in Poland, at least. So Law and Justice introduced, for example, this monthly payment for each child. And many opposition politicians claim that this is why people keep on voting for Law and Justice. But the truth is that parents that have plenty of children had problems with sending their children for vacations, with buying them new books for school, and nobody saw them. So this was again the matter of dignity and noticing the problems of underprivileged groups. So I think it's not only about the illiberal trends and populistic trends in our region, but it's also the matter of quality of opposition that doesn't want to see those groups and respect them in the way they need to be respected.
Yeah, both of you have actually made the point that these governments do a good job of delivering to the people what they need. It's a bit like the old Bob Dylan song, not necessarily what they want. Let's add the pandemic to the witch's brew. Clearly, one consequence has been extraordinary powers granted to governments all over the place. Borders have been closed, curfews imposed, shops, schools, churches closed. Everybody's experienced that more or less. Some are beginning to unwind, but put aside where we are at this moment, as you think about the future, sooner or later, the COVID will be behind us, inshallah. What do you think will be the lingering consequences in your countries of the COVID experience in this regard?
I'm really afraid that the consequence will be a drift from the underprivileged group protection, from the minority rights, like in Poland, LGBTQ people, people with disabilities, into the rights of community, like that also have their needs and have not been addressed systematically, like healthcare system. The COVID proved that our healthcare system does not function properly. We knew that before, but now we see the utmost urgency to deal with that. So I think that the government will take care of healthcare system, of pension system, but will neglect the protection of minorities, and it will be easily justified by the pandemic that took such a great toll of people that are struggling with consequences, or with the death toll that we've seen in Poland. But the problem is also something that it's hard for me to explain in English, but I will try, that we step by step we get used to the limitations of our democratic freedoms and rights. So, for example, COVID enabled our government to ban public gatherings that are one of the crucial things in democracy, to criticize the government, to claim what we want to claim, for example, protest against some new laws. So the government easily could just introduce a ban on public gatherings. And since at the beginning people were protesting against that, we got used to it. And I'm afraid that some of the limitations will stay with us for not only in this interim period, but will also stay forever, for decades. And the face of our democracy will change.
András, how do you see the lingering consequences of COVID for your country?
I think they are tragic. And one of the reasons why they are so tragic is that the Hungarian government has been traditionally, the Orban government for a long time, adopting policies that are rather against the bottom 10, 15, 20% of society. So unlike what Zuzanna was saying about the Polish example of giving funds to families in need, the Hungarian social transfers were significantly reduced over the past 10 years. I just saw a number yesterday. It's about 5% of the GDP. The decrease amounts to about 5% of the GDP. That's a very significant amount of reduction of social transfers. So when the COVID hit society last year, and people first had just to shut down this and that shop and the restaurant and the bar, but within a few weeks and months, people actually started to lose their job as well, and there was very little to fall back on for these families. And it's been going on for a year now in Hungary. There were some restrictions lifted in the summer, but now they are again in place for months now. And the government has been saying very clearly that they are not willing to change social policies. So what I'm really terrified about is that once COVID is gone from the cover pages of the media, and they will start talking to people, everyday people in the cities, but also in the villages, about their reality, how their life prospects look like currently, we'll see a very, very grim picture. And because the government has a very different policy to address it than what, for example, I personally believe would be helpful in such a situation, I'm afraid that social tensions will just grow after lifting of the restrictions. And similarly, what Zuzanna said, I mean, the Hungarian healthcare system, and it goes back decades. It's not the responsibility of this particular government, but the Hungarian healthcare system is in shambles, is absolutely unable to deal with this problem, and not because of the lack of doctors and nurses, but it's more a structural issue. Again, people are seeing it now, and people are getting extremely frustrated by what they see. But whether they will be able to pressure either Fidesz or the opposition into coming up with policy solutions to these matters, I'm quite skeptical.
Let me ask for my penultimate question about the Istanbul Convention. It's in the headlines these days because Turkey has just withdrawn from the treaty. The Istanbul Convention is the Council of Europe Convention on Preventing and Combating Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, as you both know. Hungary has refused to ratify. Poland did ratify, but is debating withdrawing, and seems to be trying to get other countries to adopt almost the opposite convention, particularly in Eastern Europe. Is this playing to a domestic audience? Is it playing to an international audience? Why, in either Poland or Hungary, is this important to the politicians? András?
In many cases, we are not talking about meaningful debates and discussions, but it's merely a very cynical political calculation. The Istanbul Convention was absolutely unknown to the Hungarian public until the government decided that because the Central European University and another university in Budapest offered a gender studies course, which is apparently some kind of Western liberal Sorosist conspiracy, spreading LGBT propaganda and whatnot, they have to stop these courses. And then I guess someone in the government realized that there is this convention that Hungary ratified but actually never implemented in practice. And although it's supposed to deal with domestic violence issues, there is the word gender in the convention. So now let's use it for propaganda purposes and fight with an enemy that they drew themselves. So in Hungary, the whole Istanbul Convention is not about domestic violence. Civil society, women's rights groups, victims of domestic violence, they try to explain to the public that this is what the convention is about and explain why we actually need to implement it, even if they decide to walk back from it, such as Turkey. At least let's change the domestic regulations in order to ensure that the domestic violence, the numbers decrease, that victims receive immediate and effective assistance, and so on. Don't call it the convention, but make the positive changes. This discussion falls on deaf ears because for the government, again, this topic is about creating an enemy, the so-called gender ideology, and saying that the convention, the Istanbul Convention, is just one of the elements of this gender ideology. And that's the point when any kind of meaningful discussion, be that on how to reduce domestic violence, what to do with victims of violence, why we have such a huge rate of domestic violence in Hungary. I guess the same is unfortunately true for Poland and many other Eastern European countries. All of these discussions, they are off the table because everything becomes so extremely politicized through the government's agenda.
So in Hungary, cynicism is part of the motivation. In Poland, it looks more organic from a distance. It looks much more organic. LGBT ideology-free charters, cities and regions declaring themselves LGBT-free. and so forth. Zuz, is that fair? Is it more organic?
Yes, I'm nodding because I agree with you. The narrative is very similar to Hungarian. So gender ideology is the biggest, or has been the biggest enemy, a public enemy for 3 or 4 consecutive years until the migrant crisis hit and until the biggest enemy became the LGBTQ community. However, as Alan, you mentioned, this is more organic. I would say, and this is not exaggeration, I would say we are on a war in Poland. This is the ideological war. And maybe the difference between Poland and Hungary is church, the Catholic Church that has the huge immense impact upon Polish politics. It's the main player, I would say, when it comes to enacting legal acts that has to do with some of the social sphere or individual relations. So I would say that it's, as András said, it's not about the domestic violence and fighting with domestic violence to the best possible means, but it's about the war, ideological war between the liberal West and what it's called in Poland the traditional Catholic values. And well, I must say, and this is my cynical remark, but I guess part of our traditional values is that we are not looking what's happening in the private sphere. We are not looking into people's bedrooms, into people's houses. It's the sphere of family, and family is protected. So law shouldn't go and protect the domestic abuse victims. It should leave the families alone. But of course, what's used by the politicians is gender ideology, is that the Istanbul Convention protects only women, which is not true, but it's easily used by the populistic politicians. And the truth is that exactly the same narrative is used against the LGBT community, because it's easy to call LGBT not people, but ideology. So the right-wing politicians are saying, we're not fighting with human rights. We're not fighting with gay or lesbians. We are fighting with the ideology.
Let me end with a personal question. You're both fighting the good fight in the face of formidable and I think growing odds. I can't imagine either of you are terribly popular with your respective governments. What motivates you? How do you get up every day and do it again? András?
It's hard. I mean, the easy answer to that is that it's in my blood. I come from a family where, that's what they were doing. But there is also another thing, which is that I lived in other countries. I'm very privileged in that sense, and at every place, some parts of life was much easier. But it might sound strange, but I am a true Hungarian in so many sense. I love Hungarian poetry. That's kind of oxygen for me. And that's not something you can so easily enjoy if you move to another country where people speak a different language. That poetry is also interesting, but I miss, or the same goes for contemporary writers and culture. So at some point, I always realized that I want to go back home. And that means that I have to work towards creating a life here which I can live in comfortably. And, I'm one of the few publicly open gay public figures. I happen to be Jewish. And I happen to fight for the rights of refugees. I mean, how lucky you can get all these free in such circumstances. So use your luck and do what you think is right.
Susan?
What keeps me going? This is a very good question. Well, for sure, anger. You know, it's this word in Polish which means wkurzenie. I know it's hard to repeat, but it's just this internal anger and anger meaning lack of consent for what's going on. And there is also this sense of responsibility, like, you know, those young people now protesting against the climate change, saying there is no other planet, there is also no other homeland, and Poland is my homeland, and I just want to change it, and this direction seems to be so clear. I want everyone to feel safe in my home country, and I want everyone to feel welcome here. And this is so easy on the one hand and so hard on the other, because something that is for me obvious and clear, and how can anyone dispute that? Awkwardly can.
Well, thank you both. You're both patriots, which is a word that comes to mind and is not very popular in the 21st century, but clearly does apply in both of your cases. So thank you for this conversation, and thank you for your work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening. Now it's your turn. Tell us what you think. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, or you can subscribe to our newsletter at talbergprize.org. Thanks again, and most importantly, don't forget to nominate a leader whose work deserves to be recognised and imitated. This podcast brought to you through the generous support of SNF, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation.